Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to this socialprotection.org webinar on building on government systems for shock preparedness and response, the role of social assistance data and information systems. My name's Clare O'Brien, and I work in the Social Protection Unit at the World Food Programme, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. So I'm going to say a few words to set the scene for the discussion, and then I will introduce the speakers and hand over to them for their presentations. And we hope that we will have at least half an hour or more at the end for your questions. So please get thinking of all the questions you would like to ask our distinguished panelists today, and we hope to be able to address them too. So by way of background, why are we talking about this subject today? Well, it's clearly a hugely important issue, and the use of social assistance data and information systems lies exactly at the intersection of three of the hottest topics in social protection right now. The first is about the importance of strengthening government systems and supporting the use of government systems. Either through better alignment of the practices of humanitarian and development partners with what governments are doing in the countries to which they're providing support, or possibly even in some circumstances it might be about transitioning a caseload of people from non-government to government systems. The second hot topic at the moment where this is relevant is about the better integration of emergency response and development activities, even in a non-crisis context. And this is being promoted not only where international humanitarian actors are involved, but also in relation to national government's own systems. So improving the links between government's emergency response departments and government's social assistance programs. This agenda you're probably familiar with in lots of different guises. We hear it in concepts of shock responsive social protection, or adaptive social protection, or resilience, or the humanitarian development nexus. So lots of buzzwords around that topic. And then the third hot topic that is relevant to this discussion today is all about digital social protection. And by this we mean the application of new technologies to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of social protection programs. The hope is that such technologies will improve policymakers' abilities to target the right households for assistance, to deliver the right support swiftly and effectively, and to keep track of the outcomes. So here's a webinar combining all three hot topics at the same time. And it coincides with the launch today of a DFAT report, a report by the Australian aid agency DFAT on this topic. We're going to bring you up to speed on the factors that you need to take into account to decide whether and how databases and information systems that are developed primarily for use in government social assistance programs can or should be adapted to improve system preparedness for major natural hazards or socioeconomic crises or other things that a country may face. And of course, we're going into this topic today with an open mind because for any context, applying these considerations that we're going to discuss may lead you to decide that it's a fantastic opportunity for you to use a social assistance database. You may decide that if with some adaptations, you could make something useful in the future. Or you may decide that perhaps the social assistance database that exists is not suitable for the particular purpose that you're looking for. May be not suitable right now. It might be data security or because it just doesn't contain the right people and so on. Next slide, please. I have the next slide. Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce to you today our three speakers. That's Valentina Barca, Rodolfo Beazley, and Tom Mtenje. Valentina and Rodolfo will be presenting the overarching framework, and Tom will be giving a specific case example of how social assistance data are being used for shock preparedness and response in Malawi. Valentina is a senior consultant at Oxford Policy Management in the Poverty and Social Protection portfolio. And she focuses on how delivery systems can facilitate responsiveness and effectiveness of social protection. You have probably come across her name in this field. She's worked extensively on social assistance information systems and on shock responsive social protection for the last several years, including for the DFAT global study on shock responsive social protection systems and a recent WFP World Food Programme regional study in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide. Rodolfo Beazley is also a senior consultant at the Poverty and Social Protection team at Oxford Policy Management. He's an economist with more than 10 years experience in design, implementation and evaluation of public policies. And he's worked a lot in Latin America and Africa and South Asia on this topic, particularly shock responsive social protection in the last few years. Next slide, please. And then we have Tom Mtenje, who is the Deputy Team Leader for GIZ's Social Protection Programme in Malawi. He's been involved in the design and review of the Malawi National Social Support Programme and has been supporting the government of Malawi in relation to the Social Cash Transfer Programme and other related areas. And he's now particularly focusing on strengthening the data management framework for the Malawi National Social Support Programme and establishing an electronic payment system for cash-based social protection interventions in Malawi. So we look forward to hearing about the case study of Malawi at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me. I've introduced myself. I'm the senior consultant in social protection at the World Food Programme. And previously was working for Oxford Policy Management on the DFAT Shock Responsive Social Protection Systems programme. Thank you. Next. And of course, you are all participating too. So we would love you to submit your questions to the panelists. In your toolbar on the right-hand side, you have an area called chat, and you can type in questions at any time into the chat bar. We will be receiving them at this end, and then we will field questions to our panelists once they finish their presentations. And any questions that we don't get round to during this presentation, during this webinar, we will make sure we write up in a document that gets circulated afterwards. So don't hesitate to put down all the things you'd love to know the answers to. And if you don't get an answer in the next hour and a half, you will get one subsequently. Of course, you can also follow what's going on Twitter using that hashtag and on Facebook as well. Next slide. Because probably this will leave you thirsty for more discussions, don't forget that also there is an online community on socialprotection.org, which is called Social Protection Information Systems. And you can join that community and you can chat and exchange ideas and post documents and whatever you like to interact with other people who are interested in the topic. So I think that's it from me for introductions. I'm going to hand over to Valentina and then Rodolfo for the presentation of the topic. So thanks. Over to you, Valentina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire, for that. So I mean, here we just have the introduction slide. I think we can move quickly to the next one. And I mean, what I wanted to start by saying is, as Claire mentioned, we're building on quite a deep kind of intellectual heritage across several projects, including the work we've been doing for DFAT on information systems and the accompanying kind of work that the World Bank has been doing on this, the DFID shock responsive study, which included a briefing note, which was specifically on this topic, which Claire was also a co-author on, and more recent work with WFP in Latin America and the Caribbean, where we've seen quite different types of social protection information systems more advanced kind of at play, and how information systems look quite different in those contexts. And all of this is to launch this new publication, which will be circulating more extensively in the next few weeks, but you can already find it in your webinar invitation alongside an infographic. If we go to the next slide. What I'll be discussing today, next slide, is I'll be giving you a quick introduction on why this topic is even relevant in the first place. Then we'll be looking at when existing data and information from social assistance can be fit for use for emergency response, and whether and when it's appropriate. Then Rodolfo will be talking us through a bit of the how and kind of uses along the shock cycle, and we'll be finishing with a so what, kind of what does this mean for us as practitioners in this field. Next slide, please. We all know that in the Grand Bargain in 2016, there was a pledge to use existing resources and capabilities better to shrink humanitarian needs over the long term. And as Claire started mentioning, kind of the role of social protection has kind of really been zoned into, and a lot of recent research and efforts and experimentations have happened in the field of how to better leverage social protection systems for emergency response. And in particular, when we look kind of especially towards the end of some of these big reports, and even some of the country case studies of countries that have started doing this in practice, leveraging social protection systems for response in partnerships sometimes with international humanitarian actors, there's always some section nested in there about either the role that social assistance data and information systems has played, or the role that they could potentially play if they were strengthened. And what I'd like to mention, again, and Claire has already said this, but it's very important, is that they could be made more useful, both for the needs of international humanitarians using that data potentially, but also for government ministries themselves, both social welfare ministries and other ministries working on disaster response. So next slide. So why is there so much emphasis on this type of data? Next slide. First of all, we see it's quite obvious that it could potentially make an important contribution to preparedness and response to shocks. And for example, we see this across all of the response approaches, which were extensively outlined in the DFID Global Shock Responsive Social Protection Study. So whether it's about strengthening, proofing existing systems to make them more responsive to future shocks, maybe by strengthening data in certain areas which are more regularly affected by shocks, whether it's about piggybacking on existing data to deliver a new program, whether it's vertically expanded using the data from existing beneficiaries to give them a top up, whether we're talking about horizontal expansion where potentially we could be using data on potential beneficiaries of social assistance to expand to those people. So along all of these areas, it's relevant. If we go to the next slide, there's something about social assistance data and information which makes it quite different to other government data and information systems available. First of all, very often, and of course, all of this depends on who the user programs are, et cetera, we'll be looking at this, but very often it contains data at household level, not just at the individual level. And anyone working in this sphere knows that that's quite rare and important when we're trying to analyze issues of vulnerability. They often contain comprehensive socioeconomic information, especially when there's some element of poverty targeting to them. They contain very often operational information, because the ultimate aim is to deliver social assistance to recipients. So practical information that can be used to do this. It's always in some way geographically disaggregated, and increasingly countries are georeferencing their data. And in some cases, we can see that there may be variables in existing database that can help to capture shock vulnerability in advance of a shock. There's increasing numbers of systems that feature broader interoperability and data sharing agreements with other government databases. And they're always, and this is really important, underpinned by established and trusted capacity to collect, store, and manage data, and that can be very valuable in emergency contexts. So if we go to the next slide, The third reason is that they could potentially perform better than alternatives in terms of timeliness of delivery, coverage of population and needs, reducing duplication and costs, and predictability and sustainability. Now, the real question is, if we go to the next slide, is whether this is really the case and always the case, and when can kind of using existing social assistance data and information be most appropriate. So next slide. In order to try and just contain the amount of things that we could be saying on this, we had to make some choices to reduce the scope. So we'll be looking specifically at social assistance data, not social insurance, while acknowledging that social insurance also can play a very important role in this. We've been looking at data on individuals and households, not the broader array of data that exists, that comes from social assistance functioning. We focus within the response options primarily on piggybacking vertical expansion and horizontal expansion, just because that's where we have most of the literature and the information, and we're focusing primarily on the role of existing data for identifying beneficiaries and delivering benefits to them, while we acknowledge that there's an important role that can be played for coordination, planning, and financing. And for example, the World Bank has been working on this. If we go to the next slide. So we're coming to the when. When is existing social assistance data and information useful and appropriate for shock response? Next slide. The issue is that these registries and their information systems differ in many aspects across countries, and that hugely affects how existing data can be used in an emergency. And the reasons for these variations are simply that countries are at different stages of a trajectory, they have different histories, they have very different types of user programs, and that has implications in terms of a wide range of issues that affect whether that data is useful for emergency response. Just to touch on a few, and the report goes into a lot of detail, what percentage of population is covered, whose data is collected and stored, is it only data maybe on the poor or on a specific age group, or is it kind of give us a broader spectrum kind of across society? Is it only data on citizens, or does it include data on non-citizens? Remembering that it is impossible for existing social assistance data to include information on kind of recently arrived migrants and refugees. Is it data on individuals only, or also on households? Do we just have information on beneficiaries, or do we also have that information on the broader pool of non-beneficiaries, for example, in a social registry? It's important to look at what data is being collected and stored. Do we have that kind of extensive socioeconomic type of data, or is it just a few limited key descriptors? Do we have operationally relevant information as the type that's retained in beneficiary registries, or is it kind of more generic information that's used to potentially enroll beneficiaries in a program? How and how often is data collected and updated? This ranges enormously across countries, and kind of the two main typologies, and there's a lot of gray in between, is between systems that have on-demand, ongoing data collection where people go and apply and register, and approaches where data is collected every X number of years, where that X can actually be up to 6 or 7 years in some cases because of budget constraints. I'm not going to go through all of these, but let's just remember that all of these affect what can be done, and that data was collected for another purpose. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to of course, the potential for using existing data also depends on the type of shock and the magnitude of shock, among other aspects, including kind of whether it's a kind of regular, predictable shock or a one-off shock, the size of the shock. We have a table 6 in the report, which just gives you a sense of, depending on the type of shock, what are the implications on the potential use of existing social assistance data and information. So I invite you to go and have a look at that for more details. Next slide. So The 6 criteria which we're proposing to analyze whether an existing system is useful are these. So completeness, relevance, currency, accessibility, accuracy, and protection. And I'll be going through these in turn. To start with, next slide. So completeness refers to the number of records compared with a full set. And we've said this varies extensively across countries, but it also varies across different types of social assistance databases. So the coverage that we're interested here is that small whitish circle, which is kind of our hypothetical area affected by a shock. So if we look at that in comparison to first to that reddish pinkish circle, those are the beneficiaries of, let's say, a given social assistance program. And here we're looking at flagship programs across a few countries, but we could also be looking at the full coverage across different social assistance databases. And by definition, coverage of beneficiaries is never, almost never, unless if you have a universal basic income kind of 100%, it's always refers to a subset of population, the poor, those who are 65 plus, those who are under 5. These programs are often geographically targeted, kind of in many countries, they only operate in rural areas. So the extent of that overlap, that area A, will never be massive. And that's the area where we have potential for vertical expansions and for piggybacking on beneficiary data. If we then look at that other kind of slightly bigger green circle, which we have in 3 of the countries that I have here as examples, those are that's data on potential beneficiaries of social protection. So people who've been registered but not yet enrolled in any specific programs, but they're a pool of people who could potentially be beneficiaries. And that data kind of usually has broader coverage than the data on just beneficiaries, but it's never 100% and it ranges widely. We've got countries where it's as low as 5 to 10%. Here we see Lesotho with 22% coverage of population, and Pakistan where it was 85% coverage, and it's now been increasing. They've had a new round of data collection. But you can see that the variations are huge across countries. If we go to the next slide, of course, the higher the coverage, the higher the potential. And what we've been finding, kind of what's been interesting with recent research in Latin America with WFP, is that given that shocks can affect the poorest and most vulnerable disproportionately, often that the overlap between affected households and households who were in a country's social registry is actually higher than the coverage of the social registry itself. So in Chile, where the coverage of the social registry is 74%, we see that in recent crises, the coverage is up to 98%. The overlap between the new data collected in a registry of affected households and the social registry, that overlap is 98%. For Ecuador, where the coverage of the existing social registry is 53%, the overlap of the registry of households affected by the 2016 earthquake and the social registry is 66%. And in Peru, that overlap between households affected in the 2017 floods and the social registry is 80%. And to give you a comparison of how much smaller the overlap is with beneficiary households in Ecuador, the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, that overlap is only 15% with the households registered in the new registries. So if we go to the next slide, the next criteria is relevance, and we're going to analyze this from 2 perspectives. It's about if data is suitable for the intended purpose. If we start on the right, looking at the targeting aspect of this, so the real question here is whether existing variables are capable of predicting households that may be in need of support. And of course, the question is no, not completely, but is this good enough? And this depends broadly on the variables that are collected and retained in each country, and these vary widely depending on the user programs, and we go into quite a lot of discussion on this in the report. The overarching issue is that often the focus of existing social assistance data by definition is very often kind of chronic poverty and not resilience to shocks. And there's some aspects of kind of post-shock situation that just cannot be assessed in advance. So food availability and needs in the aftermath of a shock or damage, for example. This doesn't mean that countries haven't been kind of making progress in these areas, and there's quite a few countries that have been strengthening their data and their information systems to include more variables on vulnerability to risks and shocks. They've been increasing the georeferencing of households, acknowledging that that can be incredibly helpful for shock response, and this includes EVAC in the Dominican Republic and efforts in Pakistan and in Malawi. Now, the other aspect, which I've put on the left, is about whether the data is relevant for timely delivery, so going one back. And the issue, as we've said, is that data on potential beneficiaries, it often doesn't include that operationally relevant data, that their a bank account, kind of the means to be able to actually pay beneficiaries are not there for non-beneficiary data, unless if it's explicitly collected in advance. And this has been possible in a few contexts where recurrent and predictable shocks have been happening. And that's why people are talking so much about the Hunger Safety Net program. Is the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya collected and pre-registered and pre-enrolled populations across the areas that were regularly affected by shocks. But this is a very particular type of situation which doesn't necessarily apply to other countries and contexts. Beneficiary data by definition is more operational, but as we've said, it covers a smaller percentage of population. If we move to the next slide, looking at currency, this is the degree to which data are current and up to date and represent the household's real circumstances at the required point in time. So ideally taking into account the disaster or shock. And by definition, this last piece is impossible. There's no way that it can take into account the disaster, and a revalidation will always be needed in the medium term. But the real question for us is it up to date enough to be able to use it? And that broadly depends on how often that data has been collected and updated for regular provision of social protection, and how that data is validated, stored, and maintained. For example, beneficiary data tends to be more up to date just because it's being used on an ongoing basis, and people, if they change address, they will communicate that to the programs. But the underlying social registry doesn't necessarily get that type of regular update. So moving to the next slide. The fourth criteria is around accessibility. So it's very good to have these databases, but what if we can't obtain them and use them, and especially in a timely fashion for a response? And the main factors affecting this that we found were around who the managers and users were, what type of relationships they had, in some cases, especially between government and humanitarian actors, do we have a longer term relationship between these actors? Have memorandums of understanding been signed for data sharing? Whether data is digitized. In Mozambique, for example, that data on non-beneficiaries is not even digitized, so it is by de facto not usable in a timely fashion. But also existing provisions for data security and privacy, leading to a bit of a trade-off between trying to secure data security and privacy and accessibility of that data. There's plenty of examples in the report, and if we want in the questions, we can go into these, but I'm going to move on. Criteria number 5, next slide, on accuracy. So this affects the usability, and data is considered to be accurate if it's free from errors and omissions. And what came out very strongly here, which I think we should all be saying, is that it doesn't only depend on those objective factors, so the quality of data collection, data verification, data validation, and this varies a lot across countries. There's also a lot of subjective perception aspects there in terms of the trustworthiness of the institution responsible for collecting and housing that data, and those are things that can be strengthened in advance if we want to be moving in the direction of using existing data for shocks. Now, the 6th criteria we've added to the original framework also that we had in the original briefing note, because it is becoming fundamental, and I think there's a massive amount of risks around this, especially if we want to be safeguarding humanitarian principles in response. So it's around protection and security and privacy of data. So data are secure when they're protected against unauthorized access, misuse, or corruption, and data privacy is guaranteed where protecting an individual's privacy preferences and their personally identifiable information. And the issue here, and I think governments especially do not have much awareness of this yet, kind of there's countries who are experimenting with this are starting to, is that there's ethical concerns around using data for a different purpose for what was originally intended, especially when informed consent was obtained for one purpose and then the data is being used for another purpose. Data can be swiftly put to wrong uses, especially in cases of conflict and violence, and there's fascinating and scary case studies on how this was done for the Rwandan genocide and the Holocaust, just as extreme examples. Rapid decision-making can easily lead to significant breaches of standard protocols for the secure collection, transfer, and storage of information. And I think especially kind of humanitarians working in this field, kind of that will resonate in terms of massive databases being maybe shared via email or with a USB rather than and that can create serious problems, and also the potential loss of data with adverse events. So these are our 6 criteria. If we move to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Rodolfo now, who's going to just talk us through how in practice data has been used along the shock cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Vale. Thank you, Claire, and socialprotection.org. And thank you all of you who are attending. Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna talk briefly about the how and give a couple of examples. Then you can find the rest in the report. Next slide, please. Okay, so data information and data systems can be used at different stages along the shock cycle. No, they can be used before informing diagnosis, planning, and preparedness activities. They can be used during or right before the shock, using early warning systems to trigger social protection and other, of course, responses. They can be used after to inform the responses, the support to the population affected, and they can be used in the long term to learn and adapt the social protection systems. No, I'm gonna focus. Next, please. I'm gonna focus on the after, how to use social protection data and information to respond to shocks. The rest, the others, you can find them in the report. Next, please. Okay, let me start with using existing beneficiary data to respond to shocks. No, as Vale showed before, data and information can be used for vertical expansions of social protection systems, or the piggybacking strategy that she explained before. No, and the advantage of using existing beneficiary data is that this is, in theory, relatively easier than other alternatives, in particular than collecting new data. We are not saying that this is easy, not at all, but it's easier than, or should be easier than, collecting new data. But of course, the problem is that you only reach those who are beneficiaries of social protection programs, no? And you exclude non-beneficiaries. What some programs have done, in particular in the case of Fiji and Peru, is to use multiple databases of different programs to increase the coverage of the response. No, of course, that one issue is that, as Val explained before, data needs to be fit for purpose, and this is usually an issue, something that is not the case in many countries. Needs to be accessible, relevant, and so on. And then the accuracy of the targeting response depends basically on the correlation between the targeting design and implementation and the effects of the shock. Basically, the area A in the figure that Vali showed before, and that is there as well, that area A as proportion of the shock. No? And also, as we have already seen, programs, even flagship cash transfer programs, they don't reach a huge proportion of the population as a whole. No, so chances are that they will only reach a small proportion of the people affected, and we have seen this in a number of countries, and therefore there will be a need for complementing a response in order to reach those who are not non-beneficiaries. No? Next slide, please. Okay, now using existing non-beneficiary data. Non-beneficiary data can be used basically in two ways. One is for immediate support, providing immediate support after a shock, and the other one is for informing other types of responses. No? Let me focus on the first one. And I mean, this is a model that has been considered a number of times using social registries to provide immediate support, but there are many examples, no? Hasn't been really used. And we have seen that Vale showed that in the case of Ecuador and Peru, the high proportions of the people affected by recent shocks were already in the social registries, no? So these registries could have been used to provide support to people affected, no? But they weren't used, no? And we see this in most countries. So there are a number of reasons why this is happening, no? First, the data quality issues. Again, if data is up to date, if it is relevant, accessible, and so on. Second, protocols and plans. There is a lack of protocols and plans that establish how data should be used to respond. Then data in social registries is in some cases is not operationally enough or relevant for the type of response intended. Then another factor is that there are inadequate mandates or regulation, no, that doesn't allow ministries managing these data sets to use them or to share them with other ministries responding to the crisis, no? And then there are important political concerns about errors of inclusion. When you use data that was collected before the shock, even if the quality of the data is high, chances are that you will reach a number of people that weren't affected by the shock, no? And Vale is gonna highlight this trade-off about targeting accuracy and timeliness of the response, but this is certainly a political concern. Next slide, please. Okay, and the final one is using existing capacity for new data collection. And here we're talking about capacity, not about data, no? And social protection programs, they have developed strong administrative capacity, in particular at local level, which could be used to collect data in the aftermath of a shock, no? And we have seen examples in Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, and let me briefly describe the example of Chile, that there is this form that is called FIBE, and it's the single tool for post-disaster needs assessment, and is managed by the Ministry of Social Development. And the reason why it is the Ministry of Social Development managing this tool is because of all their experience and expertise in managing data, in particular the social registry, also experience in collecting data. And the other important thing is that this ministry already has a lot of interoperability agreements with other ministries and agencies, no, that are already in place, no. So they're better place to manage this database. The other thing to mention about this case is that the fact that they manage the social registry and that the registry is linked to other databases allows this form to be very short. It's just 2 pages with very concrete questions, no? Because then this information is complemented with the data in the other databases, and therefore they don't have to collect a lot of data, which is of course is very important during an emergency, no? Next slide, please. Okay, now back to Vale, who is gonna explain what is the meaning of all this that we're talking about. Thank you.
No, not the meaning of all this, but just some broad implications on what this means for us, the so what. So if we go to the next slide, we said at the beginning that there were some criteria that could help us to see whether using existing data might be better than alternatives. And one of the questions is, does this really guarantee a more timely response? And I'm going to just quickly explain what this figure shows to you. At the bottom, you have the time lapse between a shock and the time when the response happened, and that time is in months. So the highest is 15 months. And then the color coding is we have horizontal expansions in red and vertical expansions in green, and then you have specific examples from across countries on the left-hand side, including 2 examples where countries did both a vertical expansion and then a horizontal expansion, which was the case of Dominica and Nepal. And I'm going to let you broadly draw your conclusions on this. And I would really invite you to go and also look at the section in the report which discusses this, section 5.1. And there's a table there which explains what were the reasons for delay in every single one of these responses. But what we can say on our side is that down at the bottom, we have that kind of renowned Kenya HSMP example, which managed to do a horizontal expansion in less than 2 weeks because of that existing system of pre-enrolled households, where households even kind of already have the smart card that enables them to collect the cash, and because of the early warning system trigger. And then going up, we see examples, Fiji and Tonga, where decision-making was streamlined and enabled because of kind of preparedness due to previous responses, and financing was available relatively fast. And as we go up, the delays are most often due to lack of financing, lack of coordination, lack of preparedness. The data is not really the fundamental issue here. I mean, the data can play an important role if it is complemented by extensive preparedness measures to make sure that the financing is in place immediately, to make sure that there's coordination, for example, around the timing of the transfer. Sometimes when we're waiting for the regular timing of the routine transfer, that delays the emergency transfer. These are all considerations that just need to be taken in advance of the shock. If we move to the next slide, the next question is whether we are ensuring kind of more extensive coverage of population and needs by using existing data. And Rodolfo has kind of explained how, if we're doing a vertical expansion or if we're piggybacking on the beneficiary data, that will only ever be a partial first solution that needs to be complemented by further outreach, as was the case, for example, with WFP and UNICEF's targeting in the Philippines, where they had a vertical expansion and then they supported the remaining households in other ways in the second moment. When we look at horizontal expansion that's based on pre-positioned social protection data or new programs that are piggybacking on that data, we see that it can be very useful in the short term if and when it guarantees a timely response. But Rodolfo's told us that many countries haven't done this for good reasons, and but even that response, even that area B, doesn't guarantee full coverage, and additional kind of complementary data collection will be needed. But let's remember the really important role of leveraging existing capacity, and the fundamental trade-off here is between timeliness and targeting accuracy. And I think one of the messages here is that social protection practitioners need to be kind of putting on a bit more of a humanitarian cap on in terms of asking what is the true cost of delaying a response. And kind of social protection people often have a lot of issues with inclusion errors and also with exclusion errors. But with inclusion errors, it's something that in the short term can be tolerated in these situations, while exclusion errors should be minimized design and promptly addressed via grievance mechanisms and via complementary programming. So if we go to the next slide, the evidence on reduced duplication and of efforts and costs I can't say there was very much out there that kind of systematically looked at this. There were a couple of experiments in Pakistan and Malawi explicitly looking at this, and there's some limited evidence of lower administrative costs of data collection, recurring costs of data management, and private cost to citizens across actors. But that came with the trade-offs of some of those negative aspects that we were talking about before. Whether this guarantees a more predictable and sustainable response, there wasn't really enough evidence to be able to say anything on this. So to conclude, final slide. Basically, we've developed an infographic that tries to summarize what this means for any country or any actor that's operating in a country who was thinking about using existing data from social assistance. So first of all, really important to assess what you have in country and compare with alternatives. Having a social registry or a beneficiary registry means nothing. What matters is how it's operationalized. And also, let's remember not to just focus on specific program, maybe your flagship program, but across the wider system and broader programs, social assistance and beyond, also social insurance. We have a checklist of questions at the end of the report that can guide this type of assessment, and they draw from the DFID Shock Responsive Toolkit, which I also invite you to have a look at. Secondly, there's important decisions to be made around how you will be using existing data, if at all, and considerations around timeliness versus targeting trade-off. The preparation aspect is fundamental. This kind of is countries have developed these systems for a different purpose, not for emergency response. But this doesn't mean that a lot can't be done to make them work better for this purpose and in this context. And so there's issues around auditing data quality and building trust in that system, around ensuring informed consent for different types of purposes, MOUs and data sharing agreements that can be set in place in advance, as Pakistan has been doing, standard operating procedures that can be developed, and that's being considered in many countries in Latin America. Ensuring software flexibility. In some cases, that type of flexing in a shock, maybe even just giving a higher transfer value to existing beneficiaries, might be constrained by very simple software issues. We've seen that, I think it was, I can't remember where. And ensuring surge capacity and that staff are trained in these new standard operating procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot that can be done, even piloting of such a system to make sure that the whole system is ready to do this in advance. And there's also adaptations that can happen in the longer term, especially in countries where you have regular, predictable, recurrent shocks. So adaptation of variables, so along the principles of climate smart targeting to try and incorporate those variables that can help you assess vulnerability to a shock, the integration of caseloads from prior shock responses into regular social protection provision, and this is something that's systematically done in Ethiopia, for example, and ensuring higher coverage in vulnerable areas. As the final message, let's just remember that in many countries, these social protection systems are still quite fragile, not yet mature enough to do a lot of this. So let's not do all of this with the idea that it will bring about some big change, but then overburden the system. We have to retain and remember that the primary function of these systems is different from responding to specific shocks. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to just quickly talk through what they've been doing in Malawi. Oh, sorry, Claire's going to...
Right. No, you are going to hand over. Thank you. And just before we hand over to Tom, a question or a reminder to the audience, please get your questions ready. You're very welcome to submit any bar on the right-hand side. Because Tom is going to present, give a short explanation of the example of Malawi, and then we will have the remaining half an hour for your questions. And so we look forward to a rich discussion on anything that you may find of interest or you want to find out more about in relation to what you've been hearing. And in relation to that, just before we give Tom the platform, a question that has already come in. I wonder if I could invite Valentina to step back onto the screen for a moment. And we've been using three terms a lot in this discussion so far. which is piggybacking, vertical expansion, and horizontal expansion. And for those of us that haven't eaten the social protection shock responsive toolkit just yet, I wondered if you could just in 30 seconds each explain the difference between what we mean between these three terms. So if you have a social protection program and you want to piggyback on its systems, or you want to vertically expand it or horizontally expand it, what do those options mean? And so if you could just clarify that, and then we'll move on, because I'm sure Tom will use the terms too.
What the audience should know is that Claire is the best place to answer this question. But yes, basically, so a vertical expansion is a temporary increase in the value or duration of a benefit for existing recipients. So you have your existing beneficiaries and you're just giving them a top up, just a little bit of extra money to be able to meet their emergency needs. So ideally informed by an analysis of minimum expenditure baskets, et cetera, et cetera. A horizontal expansion is where you're temporarily increasing the number. So you're horizontally expanding the number of recipients within an existing program. So you're reaching out to new population groups that weren't covered before. And we've seen with existing research that there's risks to that, just in terms of then being able to scale down again if that's not properly communicated, for example. With piggybacking, all this is where we have a new program. So you have your existing social protection programs, and a new program comes in. It has a different name. Sometimes it's led by a different user group. It could be humanitarians, for example. And what that program is doing is it's using some of the existing systems from the standard kind of infrastructure and the standard delivery systems of social protection provision. So it could be the capacity, kind of the people, the staff. So in the recent British Virgin Island response, for example, the emergency response used the staff of the social welfare ministry in order to better respond, and they knew their populations. They were trusted by populations that had a really important value. It could be existing data, it could be the existing payment system. So it's about picking and matching kind of what's working well in an existing system and having a new program use those. Is that helpful?
Great, thank you so much, Valentina. Now, Tom, we'd like to hand over to you, because it'll be great to get the concrete example of how this has been working in Malawi over the last year or two. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you to Vali and Rodolfo and sb.org. And good day to you all. It's my pleasure to join this webinar on this particular topic, talking about fragility of systems. I'm sorry to say you won't be able to see me because of bandwidth issues down in this part of the world. But I hope you can make do with imagining my expressions. My job today is to provide an example of a social assistance database that endeavors by design to be relevant for humanitarian response purposes. Examined through the 6 criteria of fitness for purpose, it gives us an opportunity to reflect on what already is in place and functional for this enterprise, but also the real challenges that remain to be addressed to make it relevant and effective for humanitarian response purposes. My presentation today is not so much as a concrete example of the social assistance database being used for humanitarian response, but more of how we in Malawi have been working purposefully and deliberately to make the social assistance database relevant and functional for the typical humanitarian response here in Malawi. I have 3 short slides which provide a brief description of the initial design of Malawi's social registry, the UBR. And I'll follow this with some context of what the typical humanitarian response situation is in Malawi, what is commonly referred to as MVAC. And I'll close with an examination of the UBR against the needs of the MVAC, pointing out along the way some of the design improvements that we have undertaken with the UBR to better respond to the MVAC functional requirements for a response-relevant database. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yep, so the social assistance database in Malawi is known as the Unified Beneficiary Registry. It contains both beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries So by definition, it is a social registry rather than a beneficiary registry, strictly speaking. Initially, it was designed to capture 50% of the poorest households, and this has been the case for the first 10 districts to conduct the UBR registration exercise. Data for the UBR is collected every 4 years, and this data includes GIS coordinates for the household, demographic data for individual household members, as well as data on household assets, things like the material the house is built on or built with, data on food consumption, and so on. And the UBR includes a proxy means test score for poverty ranking at the sub-district level. The data collected is subject to a community verification process, including of the poverty ranking. The UBR in this form was initially optimized for the social cash transfer program and the public works program, which are national scale and conditional transfer programs, respectively. Next slide, please. So with respect to the humanitarian response, the Malawi Vulnerability Assessment Committee, popularly known as MVAC, is a multi-stakeholder mechanism comprising government ministries, UN agencies, donors, and NGOs. And it informs and coordinates the emergency humanitarian response to the most prevalent and frequent shock in Malawi, which is food insecurity arising from climatic shocks. The MVAC relies on weather data, crop production estimates, and household economy approach techniques, among others, to estimate food insecurity. This is coupled with a community-based targeting approach to identify the most vulnerable households after the shock has happened. A community-administered tool typically uses household size, asset holding, occupation, labor capacity, food stocks, access to other forms of external support, and so on, to determine eligibility to receive the response benefit, with the final list being validated by the community. The MVAC typically responds with food or cash or its cash equivalent, depending on the market situation obtaining in the respective affected areas. If we can move to the next slide. So looking at the UBR and also thinking through what the MVAC, what the functional requirements for MVAC are, well, I'll take you through a brief reflection of the fitness for purpose of the UBR for the humanitarian response, as is typically responded to through MVAC. And taking us through the 6 criteria, we start off with the first one. When you talk about completeness or coverage, I mentioned originally we're covering only 50% of the population in the first 10 districts. I think particularly with experience from the 2016 response, which affected 40% of the population, but in the affected districts, in some cases up to 80% of the population, it was very clear that this threshold did not align itself to potential caseloads that might need humanitarian response. And as a direct result, the UBR going forward is going to be covering 100% of the population in the districts. Suffice to say that it's 100% of the rural population, so it still excludes those that may be affected in urban areas. When we talk about relevance, the UBR has been recently expanded to deliberately contain and collect MVAC relevant and other food consumption related indicators. But of course, some of these indicators and variables become obsolete almost immediately after they're collected. An example being this question about meals eaten in the last 7 days. And this speaks to the issue that Vali pointed out of the need, if we're going to use a social assistance database, to be able to validate before we actually use these lists to be able to reach people. Currency is also an interesting topic with respect to the UBR. It collects or it updates or is designed to be updated every 4 years. but typically the MVAC requires an annual, if not a seasonal update. And the question that probably we need to ask ourselves is this question of, yes, we're looking at using a social assistance database for purposes of humanitarian response, but what are also the possibilities of using a humanitarian response where they go ahead and validate some of this information to be able to feed back into the UBR to make it much more current in terms of the information that it contains on households. Going on to accuracy, there's this difference between what is objective and what is subjective, and Vali and Rodolfo both spoke about this. I think in the Malawian context, from the objective perspective, with the rollout of the national ID nationwide late last year, we have much more greater potential to be able to achieve data consistency across databases as we're sharing data, but also the fact that the households have got geo-reference data, then it's possible to accurately, as far as GIS enables you to be able to locate households where they were registered in the UBR registry. One interesting aspect that comes out is when you talk about subjective perceptions of accuracy, depends also on who you're talking to. So if you talk to implementers, for example, they perceive that using a social assistance database might improve accuracy because it would, in essence, reduce perceived elite capture, so interference of chiefs in the selection process, bearing in mind that MVAC uses a community targeting approach to be able to identify potential beneficiaries. But on the other hand, with communities also potentially having a feeling of reduced community participation from a perspective of they're not at the moment empowered to be able to question a list that has been generated by a government computer somewhere. And this speaks to accuracy. Tackling the issue of accuracy also speaks to being able to design comprehensive communication strategies that explains exactly what UBR is and what its function is in the context of an MVAC response. The last two issues are things that I think in Malawi we're still grappling with. For accessibility, at the current moment, special access is being granted to the non-core social assistance programs on a trial basis, trying to figure out, can this work, would this work? The data sharing protocols have been developed but are yet to be formalized. And also there's a need to formalize institutional ownership of the database and the data so that it's much easier for humanitarian response actors to be able to know whom to approach, what to be able to provide for them to be granted access to use the social assistance database. From a protection perspective, this is an emerging topic also here in Malawi. Currently, I think security is being attained by a very restricted approach to granting access to the database, with access and privacy protocols not yet formalized. And just to speak, looking at these 6 criteria, you also do find that I think they're very potent trade-offs that we also need to keep in mind. And one of them, Vali already spoke to, this issue of do we aim for completeness, so making sure that everybody is captured, all the data that is relevant for a program is in there, or do we aim for currency? Also noting the different frequencies that you would measure currency by for the different variables that are collected. And I just want to leave it there for now, just to give an insight into the UBR, the functional requirements of MVAC, and using these 6 criteria to be able to reflect on where are we. So from the information system perspective, important for us because it gives us an understanding of what quality thresholds we need to demonstrate and deliver to be able to satisfy humanitarian response clients. But I also think, importantly, for those coming from the humanitarian response side, an understanding of what is available that they can take and use to make their response more timely, less costly, and also, more importantly, also to understand what is not possible. Let me stop there and hand back to Claire.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really interesting to hear about how the database is being developed and used in Malawi. I can see there are already some questions coming up for you, so I'll be feeding you some questions in a moment. We still have 25 minutes now to respond to any questions from you in the audience. So this is your chance to put forward any questions that you may have, or clarifications or observations to the presenters. Again, remember, you can write them in the chat bar. We have a few coming in already, and also particular comments. And I wanted to flag an insightful comment that came from Aliou Diouf, who has pointed out the importance of being able to give feedback after you've been using data in a shock response. Because obviously this will allow the data to be updated or to become more current. So those criteria of an effective database where we said we need to improve accuracy and currency, maybe some kind of mechanism of feedback that if somebody has used the data, that they have some option of saying if things weren't quite right or adjusting it, might be one of the things you might want to consider. Again, it depends on accessibility and ownership of the data, but it's the kind of thing that you might want to have a protocol on. So to decide before you start using the data, maybe you'd want to have some decisions about whether or not who is going to be allowed to feedback what into the database. Sometimes people don't want to feedback because they're concerned about the accuracy of data that other people might put in. Other times people would love to have feedback because they think, it's a common database and everybody's input will help. So those are the kind of really crucial discussions that you need to have before you're using your database, so that you're not in the middle of an emergency having those kind of discussions. I wondered, Rodolfo, could you say a little bit more? You also mentioned in your presentation that often there aren't protocols in place for working out what to do with this data in an emergency. And I wondered if you had some other examples of what kind of protocols you would hope for. Besides that one of who's going to update it, what sort of protocols might you want someone to be thinking about in advance, so that if there's a shock, they know what to do with it?
Sure. Thank you, Claire. Yes, we haven't seen many examples, mostly because, this is a fairly new policy area, no? And programs haven't been designed to respond, and the same as the data systems, no? So that's why we haven't seen many examples. But the kind of protocols that we have been thinking about are the ones which include issues like, for example, who, the targeting, no? If you have a social registry with programs that have certain criteria to respond, and you're going to use that registry, then you may want to change the criteria on temporary basis, no? So how are you going to change it, no? So, for example, if there is a sort of a PMT score, are you proposing to change that the threshold and therefore to incorporate more people on temporary basis? So a targeting issue. And then there's also the issue of who makes the decision, no? Is it a certain ministry who owns the use of this data and these decisions? The trigger, no? Does it happen when there is what kind of shock is when an emergency is declared, for example, and then what happens in the case of slow onset shocks and so on. So what is the trigger when you start using these protocols, for how long, no, as well. So the duration of the use of this data, and then now with this question, I think it's very relevant, the use of feedback as well. So we would like to see these things included in protocols and plans before a shock hits and the data is used. No?
Valentina, if I could bring you in here. We have a question from an audience member who asks how we can reconcile this possible tension between having enough data to do the adequate targeting, and so, you know, making sure we want to collect a lot of data, versus the kind of data protection principle, which is the minimization of data, not collecting more than what you need. Could you say something a little bit more about that tension of simultaneously wanting as much and as little data as possible? How does that play out?
Yeah, I can't really say I have an answer. I think it's a tension that I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't feel we're really in a state where countries have started to think about this kind of practically. And the truth is that, I mean, what we've seen happening is, I mean, many countries in their social registries, they already do collect quite a wide array of socioeconomic information, and the countries that have been doing some of this smart climate smart targeting, all they've been doing is adding 1 or 2 variables to that, maybe to see kind of whether the geographic location is near an area which is potentially affected by shocks, so a river basin, for example, and so that it's never been a massive amount of extra information to compare to what was already being collected. Now the difference is, what if you're talking about for example, universally targeted kind of child grant for under 5s, where you're collecting no type of socioeconomic information and you want to be using that database. I don't think there is a good enough case to be collecting a massive amount of additional data just for the purpose of shock response. But it's definitely a question that we need to grapple with. Just one quick comment on a study that was done on Niger, where kind of the existing data for social protection provision kind of mapped against the type of data that you'd need for these vulnerability assessments, and the study kind of showed that overall the overlap was significant. So again, the types of additional variables you'd have to collect would be quite minimal.
And I guess there's a related issue also about data upkeep and retention. So even if you've collected the data that you think is going to be the right thing, after a while you need to decide whether that it's, you know, too old to use anymore, or it's time to get rid of the data that you probably aren't going to use. Is there anything in your report that people can look at that will be able to discuss those kinds of issues, or could you say a few words on that side of things?
So, I mean, again, it really depends on the routine process for data collection and updating. So, I mean, for countries where kind of the updating is happening via a census survey, which happens every X number of years, that data is retained and maintained until that kind of subsequent data collection effort is made, which kind of sometimes we've said can be quite a significant time lapse. Kind of countries often hope it will happen every 2 to 3 years, and that's what's written up in the kind of the legislation. And then for various reasons, it can be up to 4, 5, 6 years. Where we have processes for on-demand registration, or some countries, for example, have kind of obligations for revalidation every 2 years, such as in Brazil. In that case, kind of the old data becomes obsolete, and that new data needs to be collected in order for it to be usable. So again, it depends on individual countries' kind of processes, and those need to be analyzed.
Great, thank you. And talking of individual countries, I'm now going to bring Tom in. Tom, we've got some interest regarding the use of the UBR, the registry in Malawi, and how it helps you to find the right people that you need to reach at the moment of the shock. So there's kind of two parts to this. One of them is, you mentioned that some parts of the UBR cover 100% of people in a certain area, and some parts cover 50%. And there's a question about whether the areas that have 100% coverage are more prone to hazards. Was that the way the selection was done? Is there plans to extend the coverage to the places which don't have 100%? And then, having collected all the data, could you say something in Malawi about what the trigger point is? So given all the people in your database, what's the threshold that applies when you say, I'm going to use this data, or these are the people who are in it?
Okay, thank you, Claire. To answer the first question, so those districts that have 50% of the population in the UBR, are luckily not the ones that are most disaster prone. And the way in which the decision was made where to collect 50 or 100% was more determined by resource constraints. So initially, when we started off the UBR, the understanding as aligned to the social assistance programs was that we have a 50% poverty rate, and therefore if we target 50% of the population, we should be able to get the subsets that we need for us to be able to reach those clients. I think now going forward, also realizing that there is great interest and potential from humanitarian response actors to be able to utilize this data. The decisions are made for the remaining 18 districts. They're going to be at 100%. Fortuitously, the 15 or more disaster-prone districts are the ones that we're going to be reaching at 100%, making it much more relevant for disaster response. And the second part of the question, the UBR, strictly speaking, is a database. The decisions for the thresholds are made by the MBAC with respect to how to respond, where to respond, and then obviously it's a factor of where the UBR has got adequate data to be able to respond using that. As I explained, we have been able to tick a lot of the fitness for purpose criteria with respect to fitness for purpose. There's still a couple more that we need to work on. And I think it's currently an ongoing discussion with respect to how that data can be used for social, for humanitarian response. And this also goes to the question is, how do you get the humanitarian actors on board? It's a discussion, a dialogue. It's the ability to demonstrate that the data that you provide allows them to reach the people that they need to reach in a more timely manner, in a most costly effective manner, taking into account all administrative requirements also for them being able to access the data and use it for the purposes that they need to.
Great, thank you. You've touched on several really crucial things there that I wanted to bring out and appreciate you pointing out. One of them was the practical realities that you said the reason why in some places there was 50% coverage was because of the resource constraints. It's expensive collecting this data, and it's true that this is one of the real examples. If you're working within government budget constraints, to try and strengthen the government systems, one of the consequences may be that or even if you're funding it yourself but you want it to be maintained in the future, you have to be realistic about those resource constraints and collect as much as you can to be useful, but bearing in mind that the pot of money isn't endless. The other point that I really liked that you raised just there was the fact that the existence of a database is not the same thing as the decision about the program. So you don't just have the database and then you go, great, that's it, I've got all these people. Somebody needs to decide like who's going to do what with this data. So it's also part of what Rodolfo was talking about earlier about making the program decisions on the basis of having a database, but you don't start by thinking, great, now I've got the data, everything's fine. And then the final thing you mentioned was about how to bring other people on board if there are NGOs who want to use data, that's perhaps owned by somebody else. And in relation to that, I have a question here from one of our audience who's asking about the use of government data in conflict settings, or when people become refugees or IDPs, or where government is part of the conflict. Have any of you got experience, maybe Valentina or Rodolfo, from cases that you've heard of where this has or hasn't been possible? So could you mention something about the risks or the positive examples of if the government is the one that ends up with the data, what do you do if you need to support refugees or in a conflict area?
So, I mean, we've seen this from two perspectives, kind of in countries where the crisis is actually happening. Kind of what's often happened is kind of more or less a shutdown of the social protection system and a kind of slow taking over by humanitarians to be able to guarantee some of those humanitarian principles. And kind of often with that approach, which we didn't discuss today, but that kind of shadow alignment approach, kind of trying to see how the humanitarian actors can be operating, including in terms of the collection and management of data, in a way that kind of in the longer term can be useful and can possibly be handed back over to government. And then the other cases that we see are countries which are recipients of kind of refugee and migrants from these types of situations. And the case that we personally learned a lot about, partly through a kind of recent WFP evaluation on the ESSN in Turkey, which is a very interesting example as well, because as we've said, we kind of existing social assistance systems don't have data on refugees by definition, and they don't figure in any of the other government systems that Turkey has interoperability with. But what the government does have is a very strong information system and a very kind of strong capacity on the ground at local levels of administration to be registering citizens, to be managing that data, et cetera, et cetera. So in that case, the Turkish government played a very big part. In fact, they were the lead actors on this, with humanitarian actors just providing add-on support in terms of that registration and inclusion in the system, and in terms of just tweaking kind of the targeting criteria, reducing the number of variables collected, and supporting that process. But there's a few examples in here within the report. But again, it's an area where every day there's something new that's been written on this. So yeah, it's an important topic.
Great, thank you. And I think there's probably many other agencies as well who are working in the humanitarian sphere who are trying to work through these issues at the moment.
Yeah.
I know that at the World Food Programme, we're trying to think about it, and UNHCR and others. There's a lot of international and global interest in this issue, so I hope more things will come up in the months ahead on it. Just moving on to a different topic, we have a question from one of our participants about alternative means of payments for social protection programs in cases of emergency. I guess this is partly linked with data and how you decide what to do. It's not only who gets things, but how they get the support. I just wondered, Rodolfo, could you just give an example of how social protection programs have been used in an emergency in one of the examples, for example, in Latin America that you have seen? And maybe you could tell us a bit about how they've used the data, and maybe say something about how they've changed payments or used payments.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So let me give you a couple of examples. So in the case of Peru, in response to the floods in 2017, the government decided to give a top-up to beneficiaries of two programs, the social pension and the cash transfer program, which is poverty targeted, and they basically use the program's payment mechanism. No, that is an electronic payment mechanism. People go to the bank and collect the money, and that seemed to work quite well. So it was basically in our language vertical expansion, but due to the lack of preparedness and a number of issues, the transfer was made about 5 months after the peak of the floods. Yeah, so yeah, it was quite delayed. No, the other example is Dominica, which was affected by a hurricane a couple of years ago as well, and they responded. The government responded with the support of UNICEF and WFP, developing a program that was called Emergency Cash Transfer, that responded basically in two ways. One was giving transfers to beneficiaries of the public assistance program, the main cash transfer program. So every household in that program would receive a transfer. So again, a vertical expansion. And then they collected data did a post-disaster needs assessment and identified households in need and provided support to those households who were not in the program, and therefore this could be seen as an horizontal expansion or piggybacking of the system anyway. So, and what in relation to the payment mechanism, they use the same payment mechanism that the government usually uses for these programs. That is a manual payment mechanism. So they transfer the money to local committees, and these committees paid the transfers to beneficiaries. So the social protection system there doesn't have an electronic mechanism yet. So they use this manual payment system, but the evidence shows that it worked very well in terms of timeliness and so on, transparency, and so I mean this shows that I mean even a manual payment mechanism can be effective in an emergency context. No?
Great, thank you. And that just gives a good contrast of the types of data or the quantities of data that are needed just to deliver something like the payment itself, because in one you had all the bank account details already, you didn't need to collect all that information because it was top-ups, and in the other one there wasn't any electronic data, but they were able to do manual distribution, and that was also fine and effective. So it shows how many examples there are of different ways we can do things. There's an interesting comment I wanted to flag from one of our participants in relation to Nigeria, which is just to observe that there can be a challenge in getting data when programs close down. So if you've been relying on a cash transfer program or something for your data and then the program is scrapped, it's interesting to think about the fact that suddenly where you might be expecting to get your data from might disappear, and you might be looking for some other national or population data. So it was just an excellent comment, I thought, that you might need to think about alternatives. I have one final question that I'd like to bring in Tom for, again, to get some of our experience from the field, which is about how this whole consultative process comes about. Could you just say something about, coming up with common parameters, or if we're talking about ending up with a database that everyone agrees on or that lots of people want to use? I know that Malawi has had an excellent consultative process over some time. Could you just say something a little bit about how that process has happened and who's been involved and, what's been effective?
Sure. I think the UBR is now collecting data using what we're calling a harmonized data collection tool. And this tool was developed through bringing stakeholders from the social protection sector and humanitarian response, and scoping and understanding what are the current data collection practices and tools, and how could we actually bring them together, and also understanding some of the differences that are there and being able to resolve this, and being aware of the things that you can resolve. An example, you find that the geographic categories that are used may be different. So you've got two data collection tools going to the same village, but the way that they define that geographic category is different. So if you merge these two, how do you make sure that it is actually responding to the question that you are asking when you're trying to validate and identify your beneficiary? At the end of the day, it's trade-offs that you need to come to a place whereby you've got a minimum set of data that is usable across the programs, but also being mindful that it might be impractical to collect all the data points that are required by all the programs. So having an understanding of what is the core data that's required and what is it something that can be done from a secondary data manipulation process. So are you able to overlay some of these geographical categories after the data collection process to allow you to still be able to collect identify your beneficiaries? So I think from the very beginning, a government-led approach towards getting a common understanding, what are data definitions when we're talking about household, when we're talking about a village, when we're talking about household head, for example, that has been important. And at the end of the day, having this harmonized data collection tool that people can relate to, that they understand, how they can use and how they cannot use it, has been important.
Fantastic, thank you. So that's a great way to conclude with a positive example of great government-led cooperation on, trying to work together to achieve a good database that can be used in many different contexts. And you can see the level of detail and thought that needs to go into all of this, down to thinking about which geographical unit I use and you use. So thousands of small decisions to be made every day with lots of people in order to achieve a good database. And then you need to keep it all up to date, comprehensive, accurate, protected, and everything else. So good luck to everybody on databases. We've come to the end of our time. We're going to leave it there. There was a few questions I think that have come through that we haven't had a chance to address. So after this presentation, we will write up in a Word document the answers to the questions that we've missed. And I think that will get circulated to the participants. We'd encourage you to go online and find the DFAT report for which this was the launch. I think we said at the beginning it's available from the same web page that you signed up to this on. So thank you to DFAT for organising that publication and making it available. And we hope to continue the discussion with you all online at the online community that we mentioned earlier as well. This session has been recorded, and the recording is going to be available online, and I think the presentations too. So there's no chance of you forgetting anything, and you can come back and listen to us as much as you like. Thanks so much for your great participation, and we will see you at some other socialprotection.org webinar soon. Thanks very much. We'll end it.
Thank you all. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.